Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to T-Minus the podcast presented by 321. I'm your host, Daniel.
And I'm your co-host, Nico.
And we have a special guest, Danielle, our integrated account manager. Welcome.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So today's topic is marketing conferences. There are a ton out there, and they've been growing and growing when it comes to marketing, when it comes to product conferences. The biggest one just ended was South by Southwest, which is a unique conference between like tech and music. It's like really back to back. So I think it's just one big party, to be honest with you, for 2 weeks straight. So the idea came up, or this topic came up, because we're going through like the conferences this year of all marketing and product based, speakers and talks. And the question came up, like, how valuable are they? Specifically for our industry, but I think for other industries as well, is what's their value? Does it make sense? Does it add value to the company, to yourself? So Danielle, specifically, like for you, recently, what conferences have you gone to? Then what's your experience?
Mm-hmm. I recently just went to the 10X Growth Con in Miami. It was 35,000 people at Marlins Park. It was my first experience there. It was fantastic. It was great. I really went into it open-minded and just kind of wanted to learn everything that I could. And it was a 3-day conference, which was a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it was great. It was awesome.
So what made you choose the 10X conference?
So the guy who puts it on is Grant Cardone. Mm-hmm. And I recently started following him, and just naturally he started promoting his GrowthCon. And because I was just so invested in what he had to offer learning-wise, I mean, he's really into real estate, which I'm not into, but it translates across all different types of industries. So for my birthday, I was like to my husband, we're going. And so we bought tickets and we went. And yeah, just me following him made me want to go.
Okay. And did you find that when you got there, you found more value than, say, just following him and his content on a regular basis?
Oh, yeah, because he brought in all different types of speakers. So it was talking to, real estate moguls, but it was also talking to, Bethany Frankel was there, and so she did Skinny Girl, and Steve Harvey, and, the Sharks from Shark Tank. So it was all over all different types of industries.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
Marketing, there was a whole day on marketing. So that was, learned about ClickFunnels, and it was great. I learned a lot.
Nico, I know you're a festival person, but when it comes to actual like conferences and, either product or marketing or any other niche, what's like recently, what have you been to and kind of what your experience is?
So I actually have never been to a marketing or industry-related conference towards marketing and advertising, but I went to AWP back in 2018. That was the most recent conference I've been to, and that's the Association for Writing Programs. It's actually like the largest writing and literary conference like in the United States, and really globally too. It's just huge. It's like anyone who writes or is a professor of English Lit or has been published pretty much goes. They hold it in a different city every year. I was really lucky in 2018. I was living in Tampa, and they actually had it in Tampa, like 5 minutes from my house. So I went, I took off work to go to Thursday and Friday. So it was like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I went Thursday, Friday, and a little bit of Sunday. And I absolutely loved it. For one, I mean, I'm a huge avid reader, so it was kind of like a starstruck type of situation where I was able to meet and see a lot of my favorite authors actually give readings. I got a lot of stuff signed. Like, I brought books with me from home and like had a lot of stuff signed. I spent way too much money on books. Like, I'd go to a reading and like hear one author or poet like read something, and then I'd buy like 5 of their books. So I really liked it in that way. And in terms of being a writer, it was really therapeutic and inspirational. I went to a lot of panels about just like different ways to write, like even just ones on genres I'm interested in, which like hearing people who are like masters of that genre talk about them is really like interesting and pushed me to feel more creative and want to go create more. So overall, it was an amazing experience that like I would go to there like again. I hope to travel to go to like the next one. It was in Portland this year and I think in Philly last year. So they always go to really like cool cities.
Yeah.
That you're just like, wow, that's a great place to travel. So yeah.
I think I've been to about 4 or 5, mainly marketing. Adobe, I went to 2 of theirs. Google's, I've been to twice. Majority of them are like product specific. And I think for marketing specifically, it can leave a bad taste in your mouth if you are very granular or very in-depth in detail with what you do for a living. For higher level individuals and for people that don't really know marketing that well, specifically for marketing conferences, I think it's a great introduction to what's going on in the world. And that's where I see the pros and cons, right? So I think the pros for any marketing conference is you have like-minded people in a room that have the same interest.
Yes.
And the network there is usually incredible. So if you're a salesperson, if you're very outgoing, if you like to meet people, conferences are it to do. And regardless of how high level or detailed they are, it's a great networking tool because those are the people that you're looking for, right? The marketing directors of companies, the VPs, the people that are making decisions and really trying to learn. And that's where like client versus agency kind of mix, right? Because clients are trying to get more knowledge and agencies are trying to get that as well. So they kind of collide in that, right? So I think that's one of the biggest pros of that is you're basically putting everyone in a room that can network and actually benefit each other, and you're hearing the same topic, right? And you're hearing the same conversation, and then that can spur on deeper conversation within each other to kind of understand what you're trying to do and why you're there and the value of it. Now, the cons of conferences is where I think the bad taste in people's mouths come from, right? One, they're very expensive usually, from $8,000 to $2,000. Expenses, so forth. And if the business covers it, like if you just look at the direct ROI, if you're not networking, it's difficult to determine, right? So you're spending close to probably like $4,000 at the end of it. What are you getting out of it? You know what I mean? And I think that's one of the issues is like all these conferences they're not nonprofit. They make money and they're made to make money, right? And so they try to do as much marketing and appeal to the most broadest audience to get much bang for the buck for majority of the time. Or they always have an agenda, right? Like Adobe and Google are pushing Adobe and Google products. Sure. So being able to go to a marketing conference that has a plethora of variety, I just used just 2 synonyms to determine something, to describe something, but it's just like, I know what you're trying to do, right? You're not going to talk about Facebook or Google. You know what I mean? Yeah. Adobe's not going to talk about other softwares that compete with them. But if you go to a marketing conference that has both, they're going to sell you on why they're the best. So there's always going to be an agenda behind it. You just kind of look through it and find the value within it. So if you go in knowing exactly what you want to get out of it, then it can be valuable. But if you're going in with a understanding of it's going to just give you all the information and in an order that makes sense to you, you're probably going to be more confused coming out of anything else. I think that's one of the biggest cons of it is that a lot of high level people are getting very tidbits of information and not the whole scope. So I remember going to Google conference and the VP of Carnival Cruise, I think, spoke. And she talked about how to use like data to drive results and the case study that they used and how much more money they brought in and utilizing like AI or whatever to do it. And everyone's like, oh, that's fantastic. Great. I'm going to go back to my company and tell them about this. And what happens is those high level individuals go back to the company and be like, we need to do AI to grow our revenue for our company. And then the question's like, okay, cool. How do you do it?
Yeah.
Oh, she actually never gave you examples of exactly what they did or how they implemented or the cost it does to implement something like that, right? And that's where it's very dangerous as well, is when they do really high level of success and pat yourself on the back, but don't give you the recipe of how to get to success. And now, so you're going back with these keywords and buzzwords and don't realize what you actually need to accomplish or how to actually implement whatever you're saying, right? And that's where it can be dangerous for a lot of people, but at the same time, it can be inspiring. You know what I mean? So for a lot of clients, you can be like, oh, I never knew we actually could do that. Now it's opening up, opportunity. But as long as they go in to understand, I still don't understand this, but I know it's a possibility and we can have conversation, that's a good direction to go to. But not, we need to do this, I don't know how to do it, you got to figure it out. That's where it's like, okay, that's a longer process than what you think.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I think that is probably, the conference that I went to wasn't exactly focused on a specific product.
Right.
But, of course that con is there where, everyone's trying to sell you their product. Every speaker on there, they end their talk with, this conference only will be this price, Of course, it really is a great price, but if you go into it, like you said, knowing that is the agenda, you just have to kind of pick and choose what makes sense for you. I came out of it and I did buy a program, but it's because something about that speaker resonated with me and what he was offering was something I wanted. And I didn't buy a billion things from all these other speakers, but this particular guy, I loved what he was saying, and so I jumped on it. And I'm in that course right now, and it's great. So I think just being open-minded and knowing that what you're there to do is really important. So
yeah, totally. And even just going back to the networking aspect, I think beyond making those connections, I think it's really useful and insightful to meet people who work in different companies that you never even knew existed. So a lot of times it's great to connect with that person, but then it's also great to connect with where they work and what they do, because I think a lot of people have a lot of specific interests, but maybe they don't know that companies exist that actually speak to those very, very specific interests.
Right.
And so I think it's very interesting to see how many people you can meet and how many companies you can discover that actually speak to exactly what you want to do. Not that I guess that's not great if you're if you're representing your company at a conference and then you meet someone who actually works for a company that's what you really want to do. That's not necessarily the greatest thing, but it's still really cool. An example of that, my boyfriend works in supply chain management, specifically in injection molding. And he had, through some type of conference, met or saw a speaker who actually specifically uses injection molding for sustainability. So utilizing plastic that is reusable from the ocean and then using that through injection molding to create more plastic that can be broken down.
Wow.
So that really sparked in him wow, right now I work in injection molding for a medical device company, but I would love to eventually work in injection molding for sustainability and environmentalism. But he would have never even known that you could marry those two industries had he not seen someone speak and meet that person. Yeah. So I think that that's really cool, and that's where sometimes connections can be made for different things that you're into, and that's where a conference can be a pro.
Yeah.
No, I definitely think that the network is probably one of the biggest advantages.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's just a bunch of people in the room that kind of have the same understanding or industry or service that you provide. Either they're looking for or they do, right? And even when I went to the marketing one, you talk to like-minded individuals and you realize that your problems are everyone's problems. I think that's the biggest. That's the biggest thing for me and the takeaway when it comes to network is, we become an echo chamber in our own company about issues. But then when you go outbound and start talking to other people in other states, other types of industry and marketing, and you have these same conversations, you realize this is not a me thing. This is a us thing. This is a, we all are in this together, and we all can kind of, show our scars when it comes to this industry, and we're all trying to become better, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's always a good thing. And then trying to figure out how to be solutions for other people's problems. Mm-hmm. So when you talk to, specific clients, you realize, or potential clients, that they're looking for something like, oh, well, we actually do that. And that's when that matchmaking starts, happening in conferences, is saying, I know you're looking for something and we provide it. That's why we're here as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the positivity comes in through these conferences. And also think that like niche market conferences are a little more valuable, specifically for us. Let me rephrase. For marketing conferences in general, like I said, are a good thing for a broad audience that needs to understand what we do for a living, right? Because we're marketing driven. That's our company. That's what we do in advertising. So we are trying to stay up to the trend as possible. Conferences are just amplifying what that trend is already, right?
Sure.
Or how to implement, certain techniques and strategies and, tactics and mediums and blah, 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 which we sit there and we're like, yeah, I know this already. Cool. But guess what? One of your clients that you might go with be like, oh, wow, that's new to me. That's actually interesting. I kind of understand a little more what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So now we can open up a conversation, right? So that's where the positivity for me lies, is like for marketing in general, is that it educates a little bit more on the things that we might know. And that's why for us specifically, when it comes to conferences, getting a little more granular and detailed into things we want to know is where, I think we can have value, right? Mm-hmm. So Data X in San Francisco is one of them that I'm looking into for my team, because we're really big into data right now. And they're talking specifically about how Google and, Uber and Lyft are utilizing data and have, data scientists there and VP of data aggregation, and like there are no big names, and Gary V's not speaking there,
yeah,
right? But the guy that actually implements these things are there, and he's having conversations about what they're doing, and then getting real granular and detailed of exactly what they saw and the problems and the solutions and the ways they do it. And that I think is very valuable for us specifically in this industry, is to get that attention to detail when you can network with people that are that close to the product or service, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. That's why I think, like, even for Nico, when she doesn't need to go to a marketing conference. She needs to go to sharpen her skill set when it comes to writing and when it comes to engagement, right? Like, that makes more sense than going to a social media conference. I hate to say it.
Yeah, and I've even looked into a couple social media conferences, and I'll look through their panel lineups and look into the people that are on the panels, and a lot of times I'm just well, I mean, there's some that I'm that would be a great thing to go to, but then there's others that I'm that's kind of just a buzzword. It's just kind of a buzzy topic. I don't think that a lot of them will be storytelling and social media, and it's that's just an age-old thing that universally you should always be a good storyteller, right? And you don't need to know how to necessarily storytell just specifically through social media. You should know how to be a great storyteller, and to be a great storyteller you need to be a great writer and a great thinker and creator, and I would rather sharpen those skills than necessarily see a couple people who maybe work for an influencer company or something like that, and they're just kind of surface level telling you how you need to be authentic or genuine, where it's I know these things, I constantly think about them in my own role as a social media strategist. So what I want is tools that push me outside of my comfort zone, not tools that push me more towards asking more questions. I'm looking for answers, not mm-hmm. questions. So I think sometimes with, at least for social media, that's a hard one though, because I think social media can get so buzzwordy that I've seen so many conferences where I'm just I don't see the value in that. I do not see how they're providing any value other than just maybe purely networking. Mm-hmm. But you can always go to other conferences for that. Girl Boss puts on a ton of conferences, and they have dedicated days for networking,
right?
And it's other women who work in various industries. I think that's better than a conference that's a bunch of random panels that maybe don't speak to what you want to do or learn or what you need. So you kind of what you said earlier about looking for what you need and going further into what you need after you've seen it than like just kind of bopping around, like trying to take in everything and like buy everything and purchase everything.
Yeah. I think it's funny though, because, you know, what you said about like looking for answers and not really questions, you know, like for me, and it could depend just on the conference that you're going to or what you're looking into. But for me, sometimes I like where I'm being faced with like asking myself questions that maybe I would have never asked myself because something has been presented to me that's
For
new.
sure.
So, you know, at that conference, I found myself going into it not really knowing what I wanted, right? So I went into it completely open-minded.
Yeah.
And that I knew what they were talking about. Some people I had never heard of before. And I just went into it knowing like, okay, I'm about to learn some stuff that I don't know anything about. And then from there, I could hone in on, okay, I really like what this person's saying, or I really don't like what this person's saying. And that way I'm asking myself questions like, okay, like maybe I'm interested in this. Let me ask some more questions and learn more about it. So I guess it just depends, because like what you're talking about, like the niche markets, or if you're going into it like at a more, you know,
like granular
level, then that makes sense. But if you're going into it at a higher level, trying to find what your focus is, then it's cool to ask questions.
For sure. Yeah. No,
Well, and I think that's a good point, is you went into it not understanding what you were going into.
Right.
And that's what I think that's what the positive thing is it's going to give you a plethora of things to look at and being like, oh, wow, that's intriguing to me. And that's where you can start diving in deeper after that, right?
Yeah.
So be like, okay, that intrigues me. Now I'm going to funnel in and maybe find another conference that talks specifically about that part of it or that service, right?
Yeah.
Because it intrigued you, opened up your mind a little bit to what's out there. And I think for marketing people in general, that's always a positive. It's just, like I said, it can be a little dangerous of what you do with it at the end of the day. Because the big thing about conferences, and I'm gonna pick your brain about this, is like they'll be like, oh, we need to do how do you do better content marketing? Well, first step, got to write better content, and then you got to do this and got to do, hold on, time out, back up. How do you write better content? You see what I'm saying? Like you pass through that, make it sound easy, but you're like, okay, then you go and try and do it, and you're like, what's the steps to do that? Like, what's the process to do it? What's the creative process that you went through to be able to initiate that? What research did you do or utilize to be able to quantify that? You know what I mean? So when people say things and kind of breeze through it is when it can be dangerous, right? Because you're like, you'll go back and be like, oh, you got to do this, this, and this. And you'll be like, okay, well, how do you do the first one? Not really sure.
Yeah.
They just said I need to do it. It's like saying the first thing to do to sell more is to be a better salesperson and, have a better CRM. Okay? Thank you.
Outgoing.
Yeah. Now what, right? To be a better storyteller on social media, you just need to be more engaging.
And that's where I feel like when I went to AWP, I felt the most inspired, because the people who are talking to you about writing, for me, like I write for social media, I write outside of work, like consider myself a writer. To have someone who is published and a professor or something where they have this clout and they're telling you like concrete, reasonable things like, hey, you want to know how you become a better writer? You read everything you can get your hands on. Like, read everything. Take time to write. Like, challenge yourself. Like, join a group. Do an open mic. Like, they're literally giving you these answers or these ideas to, like, become better. Whereas a prior content writer who, relied on, like, marketing resources and like HubSpot classes and things like that, like they don't actually teach you how to be a better content writer. They're literally just like, okay, so content writing, this is like what it needs to have, this is like what it needs to be, and it's like none of it ever is like, you should probably spend hours researching the industry that you're writing content on. You should probably read everything you can. Like you should probably, work out drafts and like try to work, like come at it from this perspective, etc. So I think that like kind of what you were saying, a lot of them just give you this really like outside, like completely generalized perspective on this one thing that is so much bigger than that.
Yeah. No, I can see that. It's almost like these conferences are at like tier levels, right? So like for me, I'm at that higher level where it's like, okay, I'm interested in a billion things. I have no idea what I want to hone in on. And then when you know that, then you get to that tier 2 where you're like, okay, I know what I like. Let me hone in on that a little bit more. So it's almost like they all kind of go hand in hand, where you'd have to kind of start and figure out what you like, if you don't know that yet, of course.
Yeah.
And then you just keep on moving up those tiers.
And I think that's probably great segue, by the way, of the types of conferences there are. You know what I mean? Like, and you need to realize where you're at in that cycle and say, okay, what do I want to learn, right? So, like Nico said, it's going in, asking a question to find an answer. Like, okay, I want to learn a little bit more about marketing in general. You're going to go to a broad marketing conference, and you're going to have all these keynotes and workshops talking about a variety of different things that you might be intrigued on. And then it might get to UX design, and you'll be like, this is actually very intriguing to me because it kind of fits what I'm doing as a illustrator right now, right? But intrigues me in some type of way as a creative. Now, the next conference you go to should be about like UX, UI design, and software and development. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like now you're pushing yourself to be like, I'm funneling in to really get specific into how to grow myself outside of me learning online or me learning within the industry, right? The day-to-day, the self-taught growth that you will do if you're passionate about it. Now, how do I funnel that in? By going to very niched conferences that have, industry leaders in that specific service or craft, and being able to give you like little nuggets here and there that you can go away with me, like, okay, now I can really sharpen what I'm doing. And so, but you need to kind of be self-aware of what you're going into, right?
Oh, totally.
Where exactly you are.
Yeah.
Because if you keep going to South by Southwest, you're just at a party and network. Honestly, that's just what it is.
Yeah.
Like, if you keep going back to the same conferences, then you're doing it for the network, which is fantastic. Sell, buy, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to what it's made for, as in like the knowledge behind it and the growth of what you're getting out of it, there needs to be an input and output. And if you're just outputting all the time, nothing's being input into you, then it's just a one-way street and you're just giving money at that point for a big network event. Yeah. So I think, for one, I think that's probably a great route to look at is if you're looking for a conference, understanding where you are in that conference cycle and saying what makes the most sense for me, and start asking yourself questions that you want answered, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's it's a good, like, I think your journey right now is probably a good example of that, and saying this is where I am now, this is where I am after.
Right.
And now you're honing in on that and trying to learn deeper. But if you went back to the same exact conference next year, you'd be like, I don't know what I'm getting out of this anymore.
Right. And I probably wouldn't go back, honestly. And just because now I know what I'm interested in. And so those speakers that, that resonated with me, I would go to their conferences. And I would get down to like more of that granular level, and that's what I would do. I mean, I would find out, okay, like I really liked this guy, this girl, and I would find out, okay, do they put on conferences? And I'd get down to it. So yeah, I totally agree, because you're not really getting much out of the same thing over and over again. And even if it is different speakers, let's say it's different speakers, it's the same thing.
Correct. It's high level. It's all high level.
It's all high level. It's the same. So, yeah,
like,
I agree.
When I go to conferences and celebrities are speaking about marketing, because they're the keynote, I'm just like, okay, this, they don't even know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
They're just talking about like their inspirational story and trying to motivate people.
Well, that's like some like when I was recently looking into this I think it's called Social Media Week in New York. I was just looking at that. It's, I think, end of May into June. And I was looking at some of the panels, and a lot of the panels are like from CEOs of these companies. But for me, like, I want to hear from like the copywriter behind the campaign. Like, I want to hear from the social media strategist. Like,
that's interesting.
I want to hear like who actually crafted this campaign on behalf of your company. Like, I want to know what their process was. And I'm very interested, even if they're like shy or they're like really, whatever, I don't care. Like, I want to hear from them, especially like, I know like if you just look through the panels, like it's so many high level people, and you're just like, you did not touch that campaign.
Right.
You did not touch the day-to-day workings of your company. And I get that you're there on behalf, and like that is the clout you carry as the CEO, and like that is literally that is the name of the game. Like I totally get it. But also I think there needs to be a lot more diversity on some of these panels in a lot of ways, but specifically with really specific things where it's like, oh, the CEO of Uber is going to talk to you about like social media. And it's like the CEO of Uber doesn't know the first thing about social media.
Agreed. And I think that's the funniest thing is when you look at these panels, that's why I'm like, when I look at like Data X and it's like, you know, the director of data and analytics, I'm like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Like
it's not like the CTO of the company. I'm like, all right, of Uber. I'm like, okay, I understand you might know infrastructure, but you're getting very, very high level.
Yeah.
Right?
And even if they had the most perfectly orchestrated speech memorized, they can't answer granular questions.
Correct.
Like you can't ask them some like crazy out of left field question that they would be able to like think on that level if they're not actually actively working in that specific industry. And so I do think that can also be where on the more like granular level for conferences where it can get kind of dicey with who they have. Because also the other thing is you really want people to come to your panel.
Well, that's just it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know the way that goes.
Right.
It's the name of the game. I mean, you have
Marketing.
Right, it's
Right.
marketing. So, of course, okay, we're going to have this person here and this person here. And even though they may be successful, you know that they are bringing the people in. And I think that it's important, too, that going into larger conferences like that or like the one that I went to, there were a lot of, you know, buzzworthy people there, a lot. But I know what they're doing. So, and honestly, sometimes people don't really catch on to that. And I think one of the cons, honestly, just to bring that full circle, is sometimes there's a cult following of these people.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Oh, completely.
Where you just like, these people will follow them into the deepest of darkest places and just everything they say is right. But it's all about that open-mindedness and just knowing like the agendas like you were talking about, or knowing they're bringing these people in. Yes, they're successful and they definitely have something to say, but they also happen to be celebrities who have a huge following, and you'll be able to sell the tickets.
And there is something about being like a CEO and a celebrity where you do understand marketing on a very high level. Like you cannot possibly, like, even for instance, like thinking of Shark Tank people, like obviously all of them owned multiple businesses. They have a very insider knowledge on like how to run a business. Also, they have a lot of insider knowledge on how to be a brand because they are a brand.
Agreed.
Yes,
Like Mark Cuban, he's a brand.
totally.
So he can very much talk about like branding even from the most like high level perspective because he has to do that every single day.
Of course.
He also could tell you how to run a business because he's done that. But I do think that there is an interesting push and pull in those panel lineups where you're just like, this is clearly star power. I really want to hear more granular, but also this person could talk on some things. So it's just interesting. And you have to know, like, that's why I suggest, you know, I don't know if we would do this at the end, but our suggestions to people who want to go to conferences. But my biggest suggestion would be just look at the panel lineup beforehand. Like, look at, you know, they release those schedules. It's all on their websites. Each of them have a landing page. They all have the schedule. Like, look at the schedule, see who's going to be there. Like, read each one. Like, mock up a schedule. Is it worth it? Could you fill 3 days of a schedule?
Right.
Could you? If you hands down look at 3 days of a schedule and you're like, oh yeah, I'd go to like 50 of these, then that is perfect for you. But if you're looking around and you're doing research and you're like, no, I just kind of think that one panel would be cool. I mean, it's probably not for you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably one of the best advice when it comes to understanding what you're getting out of it, right? And this is just wrapping up. Is the advice part is saying, understand where you are in the cycle. Understanding, are you high level? Are you more granular? What do you want out of it, right? Once you answer that question, then you can start doing your research. Like Nico said, diving into the panels, understanding the topics that are being talked about, who's talking about it. Does it make sense? Because it's true. If you go to some of these conferences, even granular, and you're like, 3/4 of these I do not want to hear about,
Right.
then is it worth it? Right? Is it really worth it? I don't know. And I think that's is where we need to kind of be when it comes to any industry looking at conferences, is kind of going through that cycle and saying, where am I in this process? Where do I want to be? And then figuring out what conferences make sense in that, and then diving into those conferences and saying, what are they offering me? Who's speaking at them? What insight and knowledge am I trying to, get answers about my questions I have? And I think that's probably the best thing about it is it's not a I'm going to say pro and con, everything's pros and cons. But when it comes to marketing conferences specifically, I think that in our industry, that's I think a good plan to move forward when it comes to advice of looking at where you want to go and what kind of more thought leadership you want to gain out of it is just do your research and don't just do it because of the names. Don't do it because of where it's located or,
right.
Or the appeal of how big it is. Because if you really are trying to get something out of it, then that's all that should matter.
I agree. I think that, there's something about just being around a group of people and, like you said, like-minded, but there's just an energy there at these conferences where you just feel inspired you look around and all these people are just trying to learn and do better, and it just makes you want to do the same. So I think that definitely find conferences that speak to you and that you're interested in. But if you find one that is not, $1 million, of course, that you are relatively interested in, I would recommend anyone to just go for it, because even you just have to go into it knowing what you want, but just being in the area and being around people, that's something within itself. I totally would recommend it to anybody just to feel it.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to go out of your wheelhouse on something. Like Dan said earlier, say I was going to a conference, I had gone to one conference and I learned a lot about UI UX, like you mentioned. It doesn't necessarily affect me every day, but it is interesting to me, or it could be. And there could be a really cool conference that is specifically on UI UX design. And if you want to go to that and you have, like Danielle said, you have the money to fund that, don't be afraid to go and feed into your interests and your desires for something and go for something that interests you and is going to force you to learn, and that you will be excited to learn, because it's really great to go to a conference that may be related to what you're into, but you may not get something from that because you're really already pretty knowledgeable on most everything. So even finding stuff that just pushes you in the direction to learn more is going to be a really good experience.
Yeah. I always loved this saying, you don't know what you don't know. So go out and just start to know things about everything. You don't know it until you know it.
All right. Well, I appreciate it, Danielle,
Thank
for
you so
joining
much.
us.
Yes, thank you for being on.
Nico, it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Dan.
Until next time,